Good morning, crime community. I've been reading about Edgar Allan Poe and Mary Shelley. I said I would talk about Mary Shelley's second novel. That's what I'm here to do today. Can't talk for too long. They're going to be cutting the power off my building for the day. So, anyway, Mary Shelley's second novel was called Mathilda, written in 1819. Oxford University in London kept it under wraps for a century. Why? I don't know. It wasn't published until 1959 by the University of North Carolina Press by Elizabeth Nitschke. Why was it considered controversial? The subject matter was taboo. In the 19th century, publishers were unwilling to touch it. Lost in time, the manuscript remained unpublished and largely unknown until it was rediscovered and finally published by the University of North Carolina in 1959. Today, Mathilda is recognized as a bold and emotionally raw work that offers insight into Mary Shelley's psyche and literary courage. Mary Shelley's Mathilda manuscript was kept in a private collection for over a century, with parts held by Lord Abinger and Bodleian Library and Sir John Shelley Rawls. It remains unpublished until 1959, controversial and with limited access. Lord Abinger was a descendant of Mary Shelley. This version was part of the family's private papers. Rough draft deposited in Bodleian Library at Oxford University. This version was used for Professor Elizabeth Nitschke for her early research and publication effects. Revised sheets were 1959. Mary Shelley was accused of being incredulous. Why? Because Mathilda at the time was radioactive, because of Victorian sensitivities, taboos, gender biases, historical oversight, connection points between Frankenstein, her first novel, and Mathilda, her second novel. Personal grief as the creature feuds. So you have Mary's personal grief versus the creature's feud. Then we have isolation and alienation between the both of them, taboo and transgressions, narrative framing. We talked about that yesterday. Themes and creature destruction, creation and destruction, good and bad. Was it a good creation or bad creation? Could it harm someone or help someone? These are the questions Mary tries to figure out in her novels. Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, Volume 3 in 1818. Her name wasn't even put on it until the third edition. So I have other things to read and do. Let's see if there's anything else over here I want to share with anyone. I was cutting the bottom of this book yesterday with my X-Acto knife, trying to cut the bottom pages so I could read it. And I just noticed that there's a little silver on the gold paint on the top of the book, kind of like a Bible. So if I've never read this before, so I'm just going to read a little bit. This is Poe's critiques on Robert Walsh. Having read Mr. Walsh's Dialectics with much attention and pleasure, I am preparing to admit that he is one of the finest writers, one of the most accomplished scholars, and when in too great a hurry, one of the most accurate thinkers in the country. Yet I had never seen this work. I should never have entertained these opinions. Mr. Walsh has been peculiar in animus writer and has thus been instrumental in cheating himself of the great portion of the literary renown which is most unequivocally his due. I have been not unfrequently astonished in the perusal of this book at meeting with a variety of well-known and highly esteemed acquaintances for whose paternity I have been accustomed to and give credit where I have now found it should have been given. Among these I may mention in especial the very excellent essay in the Act of Keene entitled Notices of Keene's Principal Performances during his first season in Philadelphia, to be found on page 146, volume 1. I have often thought that the unknown authority of this essay is one to whom I might speak, if occasion should any time be granted me, with the perfect certainty of being understood. I have looked into the article itself as a fair oasis in the general blankness and futility of our customary theatrical notices. I read it with the thrill of pleasure with which I have always welcomed my own long cherished opinions, which I meet them unexpectedly in the language of another. How absolute is this necessity, now daily growing, of rescuing our stage criticisms from the control of illiterate mountebanks and placing it in the hands of gentlemen and scholars? The paper on collegiate education is much more than a sufficient reply to that essay in The Old Bachelor of Mr. Wirt, in which the attempt is made to argue down colleagues as seminaries for the young. Mr. Walsh's article do not uphold Mr. Barlow's plan of a national university, a plan which is assailed by the Attorney General, but comments upon the errors in the point of fact that enters into a brief but comprehensive examination into the general subject, that maintains the undeniable truth that it is illogical to deduce arguments against universities which are to exist at the present day from the inconveniences found to be connected with institutions formed in the Dark Ages, institutions similar to our own, but few respects modeled upon the principles and prejudices of the times, organized with the view to particular ecclesiastical purposes and confined to their operations by an infinity of Gothic and perplexing regulations. He thinks, and he believes he thinks, with a great majority of our well-educated fellow citizens, and that the case either of a great national institute or a state universities, nearly all the difficulties so much insisted upon will prove a series of mere chimeras, that the evils apprehended might be readily obviated and the acknowledged benefits uninterruptedly secured. He denies very justly the assertion of the old bachelor that in the progress of society, funds for collegiate establishments will no doubt be accumulated independently of government when their benefits are in evidence and the necessity for them felt, and that the rich who have funds will, whenever strongly impressed with the necessity of doing so, provide either by associations or otherwise proper seminaries with the education of their children. He shows that these assertions are contradictory to experience, and more particularly to the experience of the state of Virginia, where, notwithstanding the extent of private opulence and the disadvantages under which the community so long labored from a want of regular and systematic instruction, it was the government which was finally compelled and not private societies which are induced to private establishment for effecting the great end. He says, and therein we must all fully agree with him, that Virginia may consider herself fortunate in following the example of all the enlightened nations of modern times rather than in hearkening to the counsels of the old bachelor. He dissents, and who would not, from the allegations that the most eminent men in their Europe, particularly in England, have received their educations neither in public schools nor universities, and shows that the very reverse may be affirmed, that in the continent of Europe far greater number of its great names have been attached to the rolls of its universities, and that in England a vast majority of these minds which are reverenced so long, the Bacons, the Newtons, the Barrows, the Clarks, the Spencers, the Miltons, the Drydens, the Addisons, the Temples, the Hales, the Clarendons, the Mansfields, the Chapman, Pitt, Fox, Windman, etc., were educated among the venerable cloisters of Oxford or at Cambridge. He cites the Oxford Prize Essays, as well as known even in America as direct evidence of the energetic ardor to acquiring knowledge brought about through the means of British universities, that maintains that when attention is given to the subsequent public stations and labors of most of the writers of these essays, will be found that they prove also the ultimate practical utility of the literary discipline of the colleges for the students of the nation. He argues that it is even true that the greatest men have not been educated in public schools. The fact would have little to do with the question of their efficacy in the instruction of the mass of mankind. Great men cannot be created and are usually independent of all particular schemes of education. public seminaries are best adapted to the generality of cases. He concludes with observing that the course of study pursued at English universities is more liberal by far than we are willing to suppose it, that it is demonstrably the best inasmuch as regards to the preference given to classical and mathematical knowledge, that upon the whole it would be an easy matter in transferring to America the general principles of those institutions, to leave them their obvious errors, while we avail ourselves, as we best may, of their still more obvious virtues and advantages. The only paper in the didactics in which I have any decided objection is the tolerably long article in the subject of phrenology entitled Memorial of the Phrenology Society of to the Honorable the Congress of sitting at, considered as a specimen of the mere burlesque. The memorial is well enough, and I am sorry to see that the energies of the scholar and editor, who should be, if he be not, a man of metaphysical science, so wickedly employed as in an attempt to throw ridicule upon a question, however much maligned or however ardently ridiculous, whose merits have never been examined, and whose very nature, history, and assumptions he is most evidently ignorant. Mr. Walsh is either ashamed of this article now, or he will plentiful reason to be ashamed of it hereafter. So we'll leave that little thing about Mathilda and so on and so forth. We have another list coming of top writers in the Burton magazine that I'm going to be reading out, and other such stories. If you think there's any life and truth in what I'm saying here, please like and subscribe, and have a nice day.